with respect to count 1, burglary, felony. How do you plead, Mr. Kohberger, guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
To count 2, murder in the first degree as it relates to murder of Madison Mogen. How do you plead, guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
As to count 3, as it relates to murder in the first degree, murder of Kaylee Goncalves. How do you plead, guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
As to count 4, the first degree murder of Xana, Kernodle, a human being. How do you plead, guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
As to count 5, first degree murder of Ethan Chapin, a human being. How do you plead, guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Hello, Sofa Squad, and welcome back to the Sofa. This is the Sofa I keep talking about. My name is Paul if you're new here. If you're not new here, we'd like to switch my name up to keep things fresh, so today it's going to be Ray. Now, as you see, we're going to be diving into a few of the updates that have come out with the Bryan Kohberger case, trial, I guess you would say, but lack thereof, or potentially new trial, documentaries, defense people speaking out, all the things, okay? So for those who are unfamiliar with this case, let's just talk about an overview of the nuts and bolts of it so we're all on the same page. On November 13th, 2022, 4 University of Idaho students, Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan, were murdered inside an off-campus home in Moscow, Idaho. Now, there were 2 other roommates that were also inside the house that night, but they survived. One would later tell investigators that she opened her bedroom door and saw a masked man dressed in black walking to the home. She watched as he passed her room and headed toward the sliding glass door. The murders rocked the small college town and quickly became one of the most closely followed criminal cases in the country. For nearly 7 weeks, there were no arrests, very few answers, and more online theories than the internet knew what to do with. Then, on December 30th, 2022, police arrested Bryan Kohberger at his parents' home in Pennsylvania. At the time, Kohberger was 28 years old and studying criminology at the PhD level at Washington State University, located just a short drive from Moscow. Now, according to investigators, the evidence connecting him to the crime included DNA recovered from a knife sheath left inside the house, cell phone data, surveillance footage, and information connected to a vehicle seen near the property. Now, for more than 2 years, this case appeared to be heading toward a death penalty trial. That changed, however, in July of 2025 when Kohberger unexpectedly agreed to plead guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. Now, in exchange for those guilty pleas, prosecutors removed the death penalty from the table. Now, Bryan would stand in court and admit that he was responsible for the murders. What he did not provide was an exclamation. There was no motive, no account of what happened inside that house. There was no answer to the question the victims' families and the public had been asking from the beginning. Why? July 23rd, 2025, the judge was sentenced Kohberger to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He received another 10 years for burglary and was ordered to pay more than $270,000 in fines and restitution. Now, this case has left a huge, long debate as to his guilt, as to intentions, as to this, that, and the other, all these things, right? So what I want to do is start with a new letter that came out that kicked off all this stuff recently, and that was a letter that Bryan himself wrote. We'll put it on the screen. It is hereby declared that during attorney-client discussions, most of which included all members of Bryan C. Kohberger's immediate family, petitioner was convinced to falsely confess to capital murder and felony burglary by coercion, disinformation, false promises, and the withholding of exculpatory discovery. The following is material to the inception of the plea. Number 1, counsel's failure to inform petitioner of exculpatory discovery, I can't read that word, during plea discussions, namely clumps of unknown hair found in Ethan Chapin's hands, as well as a failure of further inquiry. Number 2, petitioner was convinced that actual guilt was not an important factor in considering plea acceptance. Death row was imminent and advised to lie. Petitioner was to get a legal victory in entering a false plea. Number 3, a gross misrepresentation of and promises regarding what a life sentence would immediately afford petitioner, and a gross misrepresentation of death row in Idaho, including an elaborate fabricated story of counsel, horrific experience touring an actual 8x8 death Rosell, all communicated to the petitioner and his family, allegedly by IDOC through counsel, that constituting threats and promises made to induce a plea agreement. And it's signed Bryan Kohberger on July 22nd, 2026. And again, there's his name a couple of times. In this, let me go ahead and pull this up real quick.
With respect to count 1, burglary, felony, how do you plead, Mr. Kohberger, guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
To count 2, murder in the first degree as it relates to the murder of Madison Mogen, how do you plead, guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
As to count 3, as it relates to murder in the first degree for the murder of Kaylee Goncalves, how do you plead, guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
As to count 4, the first-degree murder of Xana Kernodle, a human being, how do you plead, guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
As to count 5, first-degree murder of Chapin, a human being, how do you plead, guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Okay, so keep in mind, Bryan pled guilty. He did this, we just heard about the thing there. And by doing that, you waive a bunch of rights. Now, also at this time, he has been assigned a public defender for this. And this is just somebody to help him walk through this and and see where it goes, right? Now, he pled guilty to this. He only said yes in court. Now he's coming back and saying, hey, wait, hold up now. I was lied to about this and that and the other. Now, again, one of the things that's gone on with this is, number one, there's like a lot of stuff out there about, whether people believe in his guilt, whether people think others are involved in this, that, and the other, that is a whole other world, right, that goes on. And so what we'll have to see with this, and one thing that takes place with cases like this with Bryan, is when people plead guilty and you don't get a trial and all the stuff that comes out in said trial, you're left with this vacuum of this, where it's just, you fill in the blanks. The same thing happened with Chris Watts when that happened. And so I'm very curious to see if he'll get a new trial. Now, one thing keeping in mind with this is Bryan's basically like, hey, look, put death penalty back on the table, right? I could see him definitely getting the death penalty going back. Now, a couple of things that I've seen out there that make me curious as well, and theories about this and why he's doing this is, number one, he's gotten to prison. We've seen all these reports about he's not the type of person that's going to do well in a situation like that the rest of his life, right? I mean, not many people are, but just some of the things with Bryan and his, habits and things like that, right? It's just not a good match, okay? So a lot of people are like, oh, well, he got into prison and was like, oh my God, this is terrible. I don't want to live my days out like this. Let's go up to trial, okay? Then I also see other people that are like, okay, well, this is like the long game, okay? He was this criminologist, he was doing this, he studied all this stuff, this is all part of it. Because one thing, if you remember, like whenever he has spoken in court, even like the first time where you come out and like arraignment and whatnot, and the judge is like, well, how do you plead? He didn't speak then, his attorney did for him. And it was like I'm not saying either way type situation. And so then you see him in here just saying, yes, he didn't talk to the victims, he looked at them when they were speaking to him, meaning the family members and whatnot. So a lot of people are like, oh, he's playing chess. You know what I'm saying? Like that type situation. Again, we would have to see if there's even any merit for him to get a new trial. Do I think if he got a new trial and we went through all this, it would bode well for him? I do not believe that it would, because I believe that a lot of evidence would come out that wasn't released before, that we're now learning through some things that we will talk about, okay? Could there be reasonable doubt? Well, possibly, but I don't know, right? It's not even in trial. So I just personally think with what's out there, it probably would come into it, it would not finish well for him. Now, also there is the timing of this letter and this action that he did. Around this time, a new Netflix documentary came out called The Idaho Murders: College Nightmare. So this came out July 29th, 2026. It was 3 episodes, each were about 45 minutes, and it was directed by Skye Borgman. Also, the executive producer was Joe Berlinger. A lot of you are probably already familiar with a lot of Skye's work. They did Abducted in Plain Sight, Unknown Number, The High School Catfish. Also, Berlinger is one of the best known names in true crime documentary filmmaking, with projects including Paradise Lost, Conversations with a Killer, The Ted Bundy Tapes, and Netflix's John Bonet series. And the reason I see that the timing of that's interesting is because I just found it fascinating that this came out and he dropped this. Like all this Bryan Kohberger stuff came out at one time. And I was like, is he trying to not steal the spotlight, but create like a, I don't know. I just think it's interesting. Now, this isn't like this is the only documentary out there about this case. So one of the things with this documentary is the filmmakers really wanted to focus in on the victims a lot, and that's what they did. So they wanted to give them names instead of just the Idaho Four. We're going down the road of let's call them by name, and Madison, Kaylee, Xana, Ethan, let's get to know them, and that's what this documentary does very good. They go over their personalities, their friendships, plans for the future, how Kaylee and Madison had a lifelong bond, and how Xana and Ethan's developing relationship formed and was going. There's also lots of family memories, photographs, text, and videos. Now, another thing that it will do is it'll kind of push back on a lot of the, let's say, like theories that are out there about it. So it doesn't support any of the stuff about blaming Dylan and Bethany. Those are the two surviving roommates, or Kaylee's former boyfriend, friends who were at the house the following morning, other people who have been cleared by the police, and other alleged theories that have been promoted online. And you can see this in the way that it does this. Now, my critique of the documentary would be this, is that if you are familiar with the case, it's like a broad brush of this, right? There won't be really too much new here for you if you followed it from day one. And depending on like what your thoughts are on the case, you might feel like it's biased in one way, or, well, why aren't they talking about this? Or why aren't they talking about that? This is a documentary that I tell people, if you're not familiar with this story at all, like you haven't even watched anything about it, definitely, of course, then you would want to watch it, right? I do like that this goes so deep into the victims and their families, and you hear a lot from them. I enjoy that about this because it was the first time that I really felt like, wow, you're seeing the victims, their families, their friendships, all the stuff we just talked about put on display and taking front row. And I really appreciate that about this one. It does leave a lot of questions where it's like, well, why did they do this? Why did they tear the house down? That, they'll give like kind of answers to it, but it doesn't go so deep into it. So again, like I said, it feels like a very broad brush of a documentary. And I think it's interesting that Bryan did his letter around the same time. But even more interesting than that, okay, for me at least, where I was like, now this is new information, is an interview that a former defense expert that was working for Bryan's team did on another YouTube channel. So let's talk about that. So investigative journalist Bryan Entin on his channel, Bryan Entin Investigates, had this interview. He brought together a great panel of guests on there, okay? So he had Cy, who is a digital cell phone forensic expert, who was on Bryan's defense team. Now, he was along Steve, Olivia, Christy, and this was the Goncalves. So that's the father, sister, mother of victim Kaylee. So what I want to do is talk about some of the evidence that came out. You can find this on Bryan Entin Investigates' his channel. I'm going to talk about the parts that stuck out to me, but number one, if you don't know who Bryan Entin is, you definitely need to follow him. He's a master at covering these cases. He's always right there. And secondly, you need to see this whole interview to get a vibe for it, because I thought it was really fascinating. So let's talk about the key parts that stuck out to me. So a huge thing that was, to me, the bombshell type stuff was that Bryan was in the house where the murders took place multiple times before the murders. So I will explain that while AT&T tower pings can be imprecise, and we see this in a lot of the cases we cover, Samsung phones are highly active on networks. So keep that in mind if you're trying to get shady and you got a Samsung phone. So when location requiring apps are used, the accuracy drops down to a 25-meter range. Now, this is where this gets interesting, because there's all these, essentially, Bryan's been standing in the living room of this house accusation. So he will say that at least 5 precise location measurements from Kohberger's Samsung phone mapped directly inside that house, specifically landing on the living room area. He would also outline how third-party advertising databases track unique device IDs down to a 3-meter, so under 10-foot range. And that based on this data, Cy concluded that there's more than reasonable suspicion that Kohberger was inside or immediately outside the residence multiple times prior to November 13th. Now, he'll say there's no doubt in my mind that Bryan had prior knowledge of the layout of that house before the night that he went there and did what he did. Now, he was able to cross-reference the phones with the victims and Bryan. He said there's multiple times where Maddie's phone and Bryan's were like in the same precise locations as one another, and it's like it might move from here to here. So this further, like, that solidifies, but goes into the theory that Maddie was most likely his target. Of course, this is stuff that we will never know at this point. Now, maybe we would find out if he goes to trial. It's just a theory that's based on the evidence. So And we'll get to what I think of what possibly happened that evening after taking all of this in, but let's keep going over some of those highlights now. So Sy will go on to say that he believes that Kohberger targeted Maddie, but that the attack escalated into what it did because Kaylee was sleeping in the same bed, followed by Xana and Ethan confronting and like basically interrupting him in that situation and him running into them. Now he'll also go over Bryan's travel route that evening. So contrary to the initial search warrants that said that Bryan drove east on Highway 270, cell data indicates that he took a bypass north of the airport and entered Moscow from the east to avoid traffic cameras. Now, after the whole thing, happens, he's running off in a panic and all this, he would flee south out of Moscow to avoid responding police. Now, Sy also has a theory about Bryan potentially stashing something and coming back for it later. So he would state that Bryan pulled over 12 to 13 miles outside of Moscow for about 10 minutes and then turned his phone back on and enabled a navigation. So Sy believes that Kohberger temporarily hid evidence, stashed evidence somewhere, we don't know, clothing, weapon, who knows, but he thinks that he did it at that rural location during the initial flee. Now the next night, Kohberger returns to that exact spot and he thinks that he is retrieving the items. Then he drives directly down to the Snake River in Lewiston for less than 2 minutes to dump the evidence and then return to Pullman. Then he'll also talk about how Bryan had a pattern of going from where he was at to where the kids lived, the young adults, I should say, shopping, doing stuff, being around, the cell phone pings around Maddie. And then after his last trip there, like that stopped, right? So that was of interest as well. Definitely check that interview out. Again, it's Bryan Inton Investigates, as his channel. So let's talk about just some of my final thoughts on all of this Bryan Kohberger stuff going on. So again, I always like to say too, does my opinion mean anything? Absolutely not, right? I wasn't there. I don't know. I'm not a professional, just taking everything in. I very much think listening to Sy talk about the evidence and whatnot of the cell phone and all this, that is where that resides, okay? Now there's stuff, remember this, nobody knows everything about this case. So much has been released about it, but there's gonna be stuff that not everybody knows, that only the families would know, maybe from the cops and stuff like that, right? I think what Sy is saying is probably what happened. Bryan, I don't know if you want to use the word stalking. Well, I don't know. That part I'm not sure of. But I think that he was targeting one of them. Could have been Maddie. Could have been Kaylee, but the evidence shows that it seems to be Maddie was the one he was following the most. I don't know how you would say that. I think he went there. I think he had this planned. I think it was like, okay, I've been doing my research, this is how I'm gonna pull this off. And I think that he was surprised and he went up there and it was like a panic. There's something out of order, right? And everything just went sideways, okay? I think that he went, he did that, and then the whole Xana thing running into him, and then that had to happen, and I think he was exhausted and he panicked and he basically fled. And with Sy's saying where it makes sense, okay, he took a different route, he stopped somewhere, he gets rid of stuff, he comes back the next day, it all just adds up. One thing I've seen is him creating the carnage in this amount of time, and others have done this. So that part, while it is kind of shocking, adrenaline will make you do some wild stuff, but it also will exhaust you. And so I think that that's what Bryan ran into, is this extreme adrenaline jolt and just rage, right? Pure rage. People who survived Ted Bundy would talk about how something came over him and it was a completely different looking human being in like a second, right? And some of the stuff that he did where he was able to just take out so many lives so quickly, and not just him, other ones. I can't remember the one guy who killed all the nurses the one night and did this and did that. So I also do believe that Bryan had located this, like scoped the place out. I think he knew the layout of the house. I think he had been in there before. Now I do try to imagine how he would have pulled that off, because he does look older than the crowd that would have been them at their, the house or whatever. They were known for having parties and things like this. And you can tell that he's older than them. So I don't know if that would stick out like a sore thumb, but I think Bryan's aura and energy was that of sticking out like a sore thumb, but who knows, right? He could have easily slipped into the house, checked things out. He could have found the address. He could have looked stuff up. He could have been like going to Realtor, looking the things up. You see what I'm saying? I kind of maybe even sitting outside like, okay, there's these stairs. But I do think that there was that, and he knew to go in there, go up and find his way through that. But then there was a wrench in the system, and then everything unfolded. Do I think he'll get a new trial? I mean, literally, I have no idea. If you were to base it on how we see things recently, yeah, I think he would get one. That's not a legal thing. That's just me seeing defendants, for the most part, kind of get what they want, right? I mean, if they got what they want, they would just walk free. But they have so much leeway in the courtrooms these days. Trials get overturned left and right. All these major cases we follow I don't even know if you can say half, but a good majority of them get their convictions turned over and back to ground zero with it. And so with Bryan, I'm like, at this point, to me, it's like, I don't care what you sign, anything's up for negotiation. So he very well could get that. If he can prove that he was lied to or something, probably so. I think the public would love it. I think the public wants to listen to a lot of what he has, or not he, but what the evidence is, like in a courtroom, right? But as we've seen, sometimes that doesn't even matter. It's just people will make up their own narrative with some of these cases, right? And so we're kind of seeing all that play out with certain cases we're following right now. So it just depends. But I think it could put things to rest. Almost like the Chris Watts case, like if there had been a trial, would the public fascination have been as intense with that, or would it have gone away sooner? Who knows, right? Only time will tell. So we'll see. I think he could possibly get one. I think he'll definitely get a little bit further with it, but I think it could take him a very long time. And I think he's going to have to prove, in my non-lawyerly opinion, I think he's going to have to really prove that these accusations are true. I know some of the victims' families would love to have that trial. They would love to see him get up for the death penalty. They'd probably love to get their hands on him too, right? And I know some of the other victims' families are like, oh my gosh, we're going to be re-victimized all again. So, there's no winners in this situation, right? So we'll see what will happen. Let me know, do you think he's going to get a new trial? I am fascinated. And if you watch Brian Enton's interview with the defense expert, what do you think of it? Do you think that's what happened? I want to know all the things. Drop them off in the comment section while you're down there doing all that stuff. If you could, drop off some little sofas for myself, Roscoe and Spirit, Bo and Luke, and you, the most important, the Sofa Squad. You make the sofa possible. It would not be here without you, and I am greatly appreciative of you. Now, until we get down there and hang out and do all this stuff, I'll see y'all soon.